This morning I want in your mind to begin to think about the book of 2 Corinthians. That's where we're going to be having a series of lessons from, be studying that book for a number of weeks. This morning, though, we're not going to go in and look at chapter 1, verse 1. Instead, we're going to kind of introduce ourselves to the situation and what's going on when Paul is writing the book of 2 Corinthians. In order to do that, I want us to spend some time going back to the beginning of Paul's story. You might remember in Acts chapter 7, Stephen was giving his great testimony to the Jewish authorities, and he was proclaiming that Jesus is Lord, and doing so in a very direct way. And the religious authorities end up getting riled up against Stephen because they determine he's speaking blasphemous things, and so they decide to stone him to death. He's going to be a martyr, a witness who witnessed to the point of death in the church. The text tells us there in Acts chapter 8 that as they were stoning him, they came and they took their coats and they placed their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. Saul, by the way, is just the Hebrew version of the Greek name Paul. It's really the other way around. Paul is the Greek version of the Hebrew name Saul. It's in a sense not true that Paul had a name change in his life. It's more that Paul had an identity change that led him to go and to preach and proclaim to the Greek and Gentile world. And so they knew him in Greek as Paul. And so it's neat how that works in the story. But nevertheless, there's a young man named Saul there. By young man, we're not talking about like a 12-year-old that they've said, hey there, little Sauly, we're going to put our coats at your feet. Just make sure nobody takes them while we go out and stone this person. That's not what's going on here. Saul, he's an up-and-coming, powerful, highly intelligent, wise, very diligent and zealous Pharisee. And Saul is there, and he's approving of what these religious leaders are doing, and that really they're coming to him in a sense for his blessing and for his approval in what happens. So, in the first 3 verses of Acts chapter 8, we find that Saul was ravaging the church. He was going from house to house, and he was arresting Christians. Didn't matter if they're male, female, whatever. He was throwing them into prison, persecuting them. He's even going to be getting letters from the Sanhedrin, and he's going to go to different places, and he's going to try to persecute Christians wherever he can find them. And so we stop and we ask ourselves, what happened to Saul that changed everything? I mean, I know that you probably know the story that in Acts chapter 9, and Paul tells the story 2 other places in Acts as well as he gives his life testimony. But you know that as he was walking down the road to Damascus and he's going to persecute the Christians that are in Damascus, those people who dare call themselves followers of the way, and he's going down the road and suddenly a light shines from heaven and a voice speaks to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It's hard for you to kick against the goads. It's hard for you to resist what it is that I'm calling you to in your life. And you remember what Paul says he says in response to that voice. And I think he already knew the answer. But he says, "Who are you?" And the voice says 3 words that probably in a sense haunted Paul at first, and yet provided such a liberty in his life. The voice says, I am Jesus. I'm Jesus. What changed everything in Saul's life? It wasn't that there was a light or even that it was a voice or anything like that. What changed everything? I know he's going to be blind and all that. What changed everything is somebody cared about Saul. Jesus cared about Saul. And Jesus said, Saul, Saul, why? A little while later, Saul's taken into Damascus. He can't see anything. They set him down in the house, whatever. And though he may be at first a unwilling or a cautious participant, Ananias is called to go to Saul's house. And he's called to go and to proclaim the gospel to him, to say, Saul, receive your sight and the Holy Spirit, get baptized. What changed in Saul's life was somebody cared enough to go to the house to talk to him, Ananias. Somebody cared about Paul. A little while later, Saul, he's baptized, full of zeal, full of energy. He's going out, he's preaching in Damascus, and he's spending time with Jesus. All of this stuff's happening. And 3 years later, Paul is going to Jerusalem, and he tells this story in Galatians 1. You see some of it in Acts as well. But he's going to Jerusalem. And the apostles, they're gathered there in Jerusalem, and they're afraid of that man Saul. This guy's a danger to us, they're saying. First of all, he's a danger because he's tried to kill a lot of us, thrown us in jail, whatever. But also he's a little dangerous because now I know they say he's preaching about Jesus or something, but can we really trust this person's motives? I mean, time will tell what happens, right? I mean, let's just let this play out. Who is this guy anyway? I mean, this guy, he was a leader of the opposition, What changed everything for Paul in his ministry? In the back corner of that room, sitting in the chair that nobody sits in, you hear just a little cough from a guy named Barnabas. And Barnabas, he gets Paul's hand and he gets Peter's hand, and he tells Peter, I will stake my life's reputation on Paul. What happened? Somebody cared. Barnabas cared enough about Paul, and he said, I have seen the genuineness of his faith. I have heard the sincerity of his preaching. I have watched him serve night after night, day after day. I care about Paul, and we ought to accept Paul. And suddenly Paul then is going around proclaiming and with the blessing of the rest of the apostles, and he speaks as an apostle now to all of the churches. Somebody cared about Paul. When you think about Paul's life, and you could point to all these different moments, but you think about Paul throughout all of his experience. I mean, he's had some real lows in his life. He has had been beaten, shipwrecked, stoned to death. All these different things have happened to Paul in his life. And at times, Paul even says, like in the opening of Ephesians and other places, he says, there were times where we despaired even of life itself. How did Paul keep going? I can't help but think about Paul penning his letters and asking for John Mark, but saying, Luke, the beloved physician, he's still with me. Luke alone is with me. Why was Luke with Paul all that time? I mean, John Mark, he certainly has something come up where he says, I don't want to go on these journeys right now with Paul. But there's Luke. Why? Because Luke cares about Paul. Paul's life, then, is in many ways a story of people that care. And so when Paul writes to the Romans, I know a lot of our young people have been lads to leaders and whatnot, they're talking about Romans. Paul begins in Romans to say, I am a debtor to all people to proclaim the good news of Jesus. He felt a debt of care, maybe you could call it. All these people have cared about me, and most of all, Jesus has cared about me. So how could I not care about you? That's Paul's whole attitude in his ministry and in his life. He says there's somebody, there's all kinds of somebodies out there that need somebody to care. I feel indebted to proclaim the good news of Jesus to the Greek, to the Gentile, to the barbarians way out there, wherever they are. I'm a debtor to the gospel because Jesus cared and Jesus' people cared about me. You fast forward in the story of Paul and you get to our book, 2 Corinthians. Well, you probably get to 1 Corinthians first, but you get to the Corinthian letters. And you think about Paul's relationship with the Corinthian church. Paul's relationship with them began when he spent a year and a half in Corinth on his second missionary journey. Paul establishes, he's establishing leaders, training them, teaching, baptizing, whatever. He's proclaiming the good news about Jesus to the people at Corinth. And after a year and a half of laboring, he goes on to the next city. He's going to continue to preach and plant churches and spread the gospel. He has this vision that he's going to, continue to go until he gets to the end of the world, basically. He wants to tell people about Jesus and start new communities of Jesus. Anyway, as that happens, he leaves Corinth. And at some point, he writes a letter to the Corinthians that we don't have in our Bibles. The apostles wrote lots of stuff. It's not all in our scriptures. But in 1 Corinthians, our 1 Corinthians, Paul refers to a previous writing, a previous letter. And so at some point, Paul writes to them, Corinthians A, as it's sometimes called. And then some more time passes by. And Paul receives word from Corinth. He refers to them as Chloe's people. People of the household of Chloe, the church that meets in Chloe's house. They come to Paul and they're saying, Paul, we've got some problems in Corinth. They have a list of questions that they want to ask Paul. They're saying, you got to help us on these. We got issues here in Corinth. And so Paul, taking their list in one hand and an empty piece of paper in another, or whatever, parchment, he begins to write a response to their needs, and he begins to try to correct the problems that they're having in Corinth. So he talks about a lot of things. Talks about sexuality and gender. He talks about their relationship with one another in marriage. He talks about their divisions, their factions, whatever. He goes through all sorts of different things, their speech, their behavior, their thoughts. He covers it all in 1 Corinthians. And he does one better. With 1 Corinthians, he sends 1 Corinthians back to them, says, hope this helps, but he also sends Timothy to them. Timothy is like Paul's right-hand man. He says, you're my true child in the faith. I mean, Timothy, if you don't get Paul, you want Timothy, right? Because Timothy is just like a little mini Paul, right? So he sends Timothy with him back to go back to Corinth and to minister there to them. But at some point, Timothy sends word back. I don't know, maybe Timothy actually goes himself. I don't know the details. But at some point, Paul hears from Timothy, things are bad in Corinth. Really bad. 1 Corinthians didn't help. Me coming here didn't help. That's what Timothy's telling Paul. Things are bad. They're not listening to a word I'm saying, and they're sure not listening to a word you wrote, right? Things are not looking good here. Paul told the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians, I'm going to come to you after I complete the year here with the Ephesians, basically. He spent 3 years in Ephesus. So he told them, I'm going to come in a while. But when he gets this message from Timothy, he does what anybody would do when somebody that they care about is in trouble. He gets in the car, not really, but he gets in the car in the middle of the night and he drives there and he says, I'm dropping everything, I'm going to Corinth. And in 2 Corinthians, Paul refers to this, there's different ways it's described, but he describes it himself as a painful visit. Because he comes to Corinth to confront them over their behavior, to confront them over their lack of reception to his writings, and more importantly, their lack of faithfulness to the Lord. And so he says, I came almost as if with a rod. I came in such a way that it was very, very painful, confrontational. And so he tells us in 2 Corinthians that in order to spare them, in order not to keep causing them pain, he wanted to give them a little bit of space, a little bit of time to process what he said and to choose to do the right thing. I'm not a parent of an older child. I've been an older child. I'm guessing, that's why I said I'm guessing, right? I've been an older child, not been a parent of an older child. But I'm guessing if you're a parent of an older child, probably you need to give your child a little bit of time to think through what you teach them, right? They got to get past the phase of saying, Mom and Dad are clueless, They have to get that, the blood pressure has to go down a little bit for them to process what's gone on. That's what Paul's doing at Corinth. He said, I've come, I've told you what you need to know. Now you need to sit with it for a little bit and process it. But you know what happens when Paul leaves Corinth? The critics of Paul see their opportunity. And they say, they say to the Corinthians, you don't want Paul. Paul? Really? Paul? What about Peter? He was there with Jesus when he was actually, walking around and everything. Paul had some kind of vision. No, you can't trust Paul. And Paul he's not very eloquent with words, The critics start talking, okay? And Paul writes to them, again, 2 Corinthians mentions this. He writes them a third time, and he writes them out of the abundance of agony and anguish and despair, he says. He pens this letter to the Corinthians, sometimes called Paul's sorrowful or stern letter. But Paul writes to them this book or this letter, short letter, and you have to think, we don't have it, but you have to think he's saying, come on. What are you talking about, these other guys? These people that are trying to lead you astray. Things are very strained, very difficult in Paul's relationship with the Corinthians. But Paul gets word from Titus that while the relationship is very, very strained, after the painful letter or the visit and the sorrowful letter, Paul is brought a message, a report that says something like, it's very tense. Things are, just hanging on, walking the tightrope, hanging on by a thread. But I think people are starting to move in the right direction. I think people are actually starting to listen to you, Paul. And when Paul writes 2 Corinthians, he writes with a completely different tone as he writes it, even in 1 Corinthians, but certainly what he describes in his painful visit and his agonizing letter. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians, he writes this just wonderful book about reconciliation, about bridges being built and mended and built, and about leaving the past behind, and about pressing on and spiritual growth. And he's saying, I don't have any hard feelings toward you. Search your heart. Let's repair this relationship and all of that. But in 2 Corinthians, Paul still deals with, and we'll see it when we get into the book, Paul still deals with these opponents, these that call themselves super apostles, or he calls them that at least. You're the ones that are the experts, Paul says about them. In 2 Corinthians, Paul wants the Corinthian church to know one thing. I know he says a lot of other things, but he wants them to know one thing about what his opponents say. He says, my opponents say that I'm not very eloquent. I'm not a powerful speaker. I may not have the charisma that they have. They may have more philosophical knowledge, though it's hard to say that when you read what Paul says. But anyway, they may have more, they might be more attractive. They might have more experience in the earthly ministry of Jesus and so forth and so on. He said, my opponents are right about 99% of what they say. But Paul tells the Corinthians, but I have one thing. There's one thing that separates me from them in my relationship with you and their relationship with you. I care. Paul says, I care about you. The critics, the opponents, they can say that they care. But I've been shipwrecked for you. I've gone hungry for you. I've gone naked for you. I've been beaten with the rod for you. I've been whipped for you. I've been stoned to death and back for you. I care for you. When you think about 2 Corinthians, it's a book about somebody who cares deeply. And Paul says, every day I feel this burden of care, this weight of anxiety on my shoulders weighing me down because I care about you. Was listening to a sermon the other day, texted to Alan actually as well, but listening to a sermon the other day, and the conclusion of the sermon was so powerful. It was a preacher who had, his dad was not a Christian, and his dad would be visited by the preacher when he was a kid. This guy was a kid. His dad would be visited by the area preacher, and he said that the area preacher would bring a traveling missionary or something in, and his dad was such a tough case that he'd open the door and tell the visiting guy, sick him, okay, it's your turn for this guy to blow up at you. But he said he would come and he would try to evangelize to him, whatever, and his answer would always be the same thing. You don't care about me. You just want another name on the roll and another contribution. That's all you care about. You don't care about me. And he said that happened again and again and again. Every time that he ever talked to his dad about the church, that was always what happened. And he said you could hear my mom crying in the other room, but he said that the accusation again and again was, you don't care. He said that happened every single time except one time. When he said he was about down to 85 pounds in the hospital, at the end of his life, had dealt with all sorts of health problems, and the end was rapidly approaching, could hardly talk. He would scribble down on notepads and whatever was in front of him. And so this guy, he flew in to see his dad, and his dad basically told him, I want you to tell this story. And so he says, well, what's the story? And his dad simply wrote down, I was wrong. I was wrong. Why did he say he was wrong? Because if you looked at his hospital room, there was a muffin basket and 18 cards and 3 things of flowers because his wife's church cared. Paul, in writing to the Corinthians, says, I want you to know that above everything else I care. You can't have a church without people that care, can you? And so our challenge and our call today is to ask ourselves, do I care? Do I care? If you're here this morning, I want you to know, if you're not following Jesus, I want you to know that He cares about you. And I'm so glad for Carter and for so many others recently that have been baptized into Christ, that they know Jesus cares for me. If you're here today and you haven't chosen to let Jesus care for you, you haven't responded to Him in faith and said, I want to be immersed into Christ and follow Him for the rest of my life, I want to offer you the invitation to come forward now as we stand and sing.